Ladies and gentlemen, there's no cause for alarm. A young lady has fainted. She is being attended to by a doctor and is quite all right. So please remain seated. The movie will begin again right away. I repeat, there is no cause for alarm.
Welcome to episode 34 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and for this week's Double Bill we are off to the theatre, taking in the works of William Shakespeare and a 1980s stage musical, along with a healthy slice of murder and mayhem on the side. First up, we have Theatre of Blood from 1973, directed by Douglas Hickox. This stars Vincent Price, Diana Rigg, Ian Hendry, and a whole cast of British screen talent, including Robert Morley, Dennis Price, Harry Andrews, Michael Hordern, and Arthur Lowe. Then we head across to Italy for Stagefright from 1987, directed by Michele Soavi and starring David Brandon, Barbara Cupisti, Mary Sellers, and Giovanni Lombardo Radice. Along the way, we'll be discussing the life and career of Vincent Price, actor, writer, and director Luigi Montefiore, better known as George Eastman, the career of director Michele Soavi, and much, much more. Before we do any of that, though, a rather quick and very embarrassing correction from episode 28. During that episode, I continually referred to the actor Dana Andrews as Dana Andrews, and this was, of course, completely incorrect. As I say, incredibly embarrassing, and an incident that only serves to highlight the risks involved in pronouncing a name that you've only ever seen written down. A bit like the episode of The Simpsons, where Marge tells Bart to run like the wind. So, as I say, all a bit embarrassing, and I'd just like to offer the correct pronunciation and also my sincere apologies to the late Dana Andrews. And now that's out of the way, let's move very swiftly on to the main sources that I've used for this week's episode, all of which will be listed and linked in the show notes. So for Theatre of Blood, I have referenced the website vincentprice.com, and the books Into the Velvet Darkness, a celebration of Vincent Price, published by We Belong Dead, and Theatre of Blood by John Llewellyn Probert. And for Stagefright, I have referenced the book Spaghetti Nightmares, Italian Fantasy Horrors, as seen through the eyes of their protagonists, by Luca M. Palmerini and Gaetano Mistretta. I've also referenced an interview with Michele Soavi that is available on fangoria.com, and also an interview from the Shameless Entertainment Blu-ray release. And for both films, I have, as usual, referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movies, cast, and crew. We talked briefly about Vincent Price back in episode 2, when we discussed his folk horror movie Witchfinder General from 1968. During that episode, we didn't really have the time to discuss the actor's life and career in much detail, so I'm beginning this week's show with exactly that. In a career spanning more than 60 years, Vincent Price appeared in over 90 movies, and of these, only around 30 can be counted as horror films, depending of course on your classification. Very much a Renaissance man, in addition to movies, television and radio work, he was an art collector, art consultant and lecturer, a gourmet cook, cookbook author and stage actor. But for many, it is the horror genre to which his name is indelibly attached. He was born on May the 27th, 1911 in St. Louis, Missouri. His father was the president of a candy manufacturing company, and he was raised in considerable wealth and comfort, something aided by the fact that his grandfather invented Dr. Price's baking powder, ensuring the family fortune. Of Welsh and English descent, his family line can be traced back to the Mayflower, and his ancestor, Peregrine White, was actually born on the ship when it was docked in Provincetown Harbour, making him the first non-Indigenous child born in the region that would become colonial Massachusetts. Leaving school, he studied history and English at Yale University, and it was here that he first began performing, appearing in stage productions, while also working on the campus magazine, the Yale Record. Following this, he moved to England, where he studied history and art at the Courtauld Institute of Art, part of the University of London. But, bitten by the acting bug, he began to perform on stage professionally, making his debut in a production of Chicago at the Gate Theatre in Dublin. In 1935, he played Prince Albert in another Gate Theatre production, this time of the play Victoria Regina, which was, unsurprisingly, about Queen Victoria. When it transferred from Dublin to New York, he made his Broadway debut in the same role, continuing to perform the part for 2 seasons until 1937. Although he would continue his stage career, including performances with the Orson Welles Mercury Theatre Company in 1938, his stage success soon caught the attention of Hollywood, and he made his feature film debut in the 1938 comedy Service de Luxe, before playing Sir Walter Raleigh in the 1939 film The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, opposite Errol Flynn, Bette Davis, and Olivia de Havilland. In the same year, he appeared opposite Boris Karloff and Basil Rathbone in the historical drama Tower of London, playing the Duke of Clarence, a role that has particular resonance with the first of this week's films, more on which later. A year later, he made his first horror-adjacent appearance in the science fiction horror The Invisible Man Returns, the sequel to the 1933 movie The Invisible Man. And in the same year, he also appeared in the gothic drama The House of Seven Gables and the war drama Green Hell, which was directed by James Whale. His screen career continued with appearances in numerous films, including the classic film noir Laura in 1944, opposite Gene Tierney and Dana Andrews, said it properly this time, and also Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948. And although some of the films already mentioned can be classified as horror, it was really in 1953 that he secured the role that would begin his long-standing connection with the genre, as Professor Henry Jarrod in House of Wax, the first major studio colour movie to be filmed entirely in 3D. This was a remake of the 1933 film Mystery of the Wax Museum, and featured Price as, huge spoiler coming up, a disfigured sculptor who opens up a wax museum populated by the wax-coated corpses of people he has murdered. Although it has now gone on to be regarded as a classic, and was in fact later preserved in the National Film Registry of the Library of Congress, many reviews of the time were less than favourable. The New York Times said that it was antique in its melodramatic plot and style, while The New Yorker said that it set movies back about 49 years, which is a rather specific number there, from critic John McCartan. McCartan also went on to say, quote, "When Mr. Price started clamping around and choking ladies with knots that wouldn't pass muster at a Cub Scout meeting, I took off my glasses once and for all, put on my hat and left." End quote. Regardless, Price's career continued apace, first starring as Casanova opposite Joan Fontaine and Bob Hope in Casanova's Big Night in 1944, and in the same year, another 3D horror movie. This was The Mad Magician, in which he played, surprisingly enough, a mad magician who murders first his employer and then several other people to try to cover up his crime. Described as cheesy, fun, and demented by critics at the time, it wasn't a huge success and was compared unfavourably to House of Wax by critics who seem to have had a very poor short-term memory when it came to their earlier reviews. A year later, in 1955, he appeared as the Persian poet Omar Khayyam in the adventure movie Son of Sinbad, and then in 1956 appeared in 4 more movies, including another film noir with Dana Andrews, While the City Sleeps, and Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, opposite Charlton Heston. Although by this point he had appeared in more than a few horror films, in 1958 his horror career really took off, with several movies appearing in quick succession. First up was The Fly, in which he played the brother of the unfortunate scientist who has become part man and part housefly following a scientific experiment. A fairly grisly film for the time, Price seemed to have had a great time on set, recalling the difficulty of filming the climax without bursting into laughter. Unlike the David Cronenberg body horror remake from 1986, in the original version, the scientist ends up with the giant head and arm of a fly, while a fly ends up with the miniature arm and head of the scientist. At the climax of the film, trapped in a spider's web, the fly-man hybrid ends up pitifully calling for help as a comparatively gigantic spider approaches to devour him, with Price describing the challenge of filming as follows, quote, "We could never quite get the lines out, because every time that little voice of the fly would say, 'Help me,' we were just screaming with laughter. It was terrible. It took us about 20 minutes to finally get it." End quote. Once again, this film was not particularly well received by the critics, but it was a huge box office success, grossing $3 million in the US against a budget of less than $500,000. It became one of the biggest hits of the year for Fox Studios, and the financial success boosted Price's career and made him a full-blown horror star. This was immediately followed a year later by 1959's The Return of the Fly, and also William Castle's The House on Haunted Hill. In Castle's movie, Price plays a suave and villainous millionaire who invites 5 people to spend the night in a haunted house, with the challenge that whoever survives will win $10,000. With exteriors filmed as a house by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, the film was promoted by producer Castle with one of his notorious gimmicks. This one was called Emergo, which promised that spirits would emerge from the screen, but which in reality involved a plastic skeleton flying over the audience on a system of wires and pulleys. And, as I'm sure some of you already know, this was very loosely remade in 1999, starring Geoffrey Rush and Famke Janssen. Another film produced by Castle was The Tingler, which was released in the same year. In this, Price plays a pathologist who discovers a parasite that grows on the human spine during states of extreme fear. This is the Tingler of the title, a giant millipede-looking monster that can only be destroyed by screaming. And, as it was a Castle film, this too came with its own gimmicks. Firstly, although filmed in black and white, the movie suddenly switches to colour for a scene depicting blood pouring from bathroom taps. And this was a trick that was also used in the movie Jack the Ripper, which was also released in the same year. But, perhaps more famously, Castle also utilised a stunt called Percepto. This featured electrical buzzers attached to theatre seats that would be set off during the film's climax. In this sequence, the Tingler is loose in a movie theatre, at which point the screen goes completely blank and Price tells the audience members to scream for their lives. All of which makes the modern-day promotional popcorn bucket look more than a little bland by comparison. His final horror of 1959 was The Bat, which we discussed back in episode 12 when we covered old Dark House movies. In this, Price plays a murderer who may or may not be the titular Bat, a masked killer terrorising a small town. It's a very fun movie, featuring a typically suave and menacing performance by Price, and as it's in the public domain, it's available widely to watch on YouTube. And then, a year later, he would form a partnership which would lead to what are widely considered to be some of his greatest horror performances. This was with the king of low-budget exploitation, Roger Corman, and the films were a series of adaptations of the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Beginning with House of Usher in 1960, Price would star in 7 of the 8 Corman Poe adaptations, with only one, 1962's The Premature Burial, starring Ray Milland instead. The others, in order of release, are 1961's The Pit and the Pendulum, which cast him briefly opposite the queen of Italian Gothic horror, Barbara Steele, the anthology film Tales of Terror in 1962, co-starring Peter Lorre and Basil Rathbone, 1963's The Raven, again co-starring Peter Lorre, this time alongside Boris Karloff and a very early career Jack Nicholson, and The Haunted Palace, also released in 1963, and which, although allegedly based on Edgar Allan Poe, was in reality an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. In 1964, the final 2 films of the Poe series were released, The Tomb of Ligeia, and my personal favourite, and widely regarded as the best of the cycle, The Mask of the Red Death, which we'll be covering later in the series. But these were not the only films that he released during this period, which gives you some idea of how packed his work schedule must have been. Between 1961 and 1964, he also starred in Tower of London, again for Roger Corman, the anthology movie Twice Told Tales, based on stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne, the Comedy of Terrors for director Jacques Tourneur, once again opposite Basil Rathbone, Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff, and The Last Man on Earth, adapted from the novel I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Following this, there was a minor detour from the horror movie, and he starred in the 1965 spy comedy Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine. This was directed by Norman Taurog, and in this, Price played a mad scientist who plans to rob the richest men in the world using an army of bikini-clad robots, a plan that seems more appealing to me with every passing day. In the same year, he also starred as the villainous leader of The City Under the Sea, the final movie directed by Jacques Tourneur, and which was based on H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth. A year later, he appeared as Dr. Goldfoot once again in the 1966 follow-up Dr. Goldfoot and the Girl Bombs, which was directed by, rather surprisingly, Italian director Mario Bava. At the same time, he also appeared as the villainous Egghead in the Adam West Batman TV series. In 1968, he travelled to England and made Witchfinder General, which we discussed a few weeks ago, and then continued on in British horror with The Oblong Box in 1969, Scream and Scream Again with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in 1970, and proto-folk horror Cry of the Banshee, which was also released in 1970. Staying in the UK, he then made a pair of films in which he played the titular villain, Dr. Anton Phibes. 1971's The Abominable Dr. Phibes features the Doctor seeking revenge on the surgeons who he blames for his wife's death, killing them in manners very loosely inspired by the biblical plagues of Egypt. Then, in its 1972 follow-up, Dr. Phibes rises again. He travels to Egypt to search for the River of Eternal Life. Incredibly camp and hugely entertaining, both were directed by Robert Fust, who we discussed all the way back in episode 4 when we covered his thriller And Soon the Darkness. Both are widely available on most streaming services and YouTube, and I highly recommend them. If nothing else, with their high camp and extremely creative murders, they seem to act almost as a dress rehearsal, if you'll forgive the pun, for our first movie of the week. All of which does indeed bring us to 1973's Theatre of Blood. This was directed by Douglas Hickox and stars, of course, Vincent Price, along with Diana Rigg, Ian Hendry, Robert Morley, Dennis Price, Jack Hawkins, Diana Dawes, Michael Hordern, in fact, pretty much any British character actor of the 1970s that you could possibly think of. And so now it comes to that point in the show where I give you a spoiler warning. Moving forward, I'm going to be discussing pretty much all of the plot elements of Theatre of Blood, including a rather surprising twist, so, as with all of these episodes, please do tread very carefully from this point onwards. In Theatre of Blood, Price stars as Edward Lionheart, a supposedly terrible Shakespearean actor who, following years of criticism and humiliation from the London Theatre Critics Circle, appears to take his own life. However, unbeknownst to the critics and the police, Lionheart is in fact very much alive and plotting a very spectacular revenge. Across the course of the narrative, the majority of the critics' circle are slaughtered using methods inspired by the works of Shakespeare, and if they'd shown the movie to me in my third-year English class, I probably would have paid more attention. One is stabbed to death on the Ides of March in a tribute to Julius Caesar, another has his heart cut out in a rewriting of The Merchant of Venice, and yet another is drowned in a vat of wine, in an homage to the death of Richard III's Duke of Clarence, the very role that Price himself played in the 1939 movie Tower of London. And fair warning, those of you who regularly visit the website doesthedogdie.com might want to look away for the killing inspired by the play Titus Andronicus, in which Queen Tamora is served her children baked in a pie. This idea was rather shamelessly stolen for Game of Thrones, but is done to incredibly grisly, and it has to be said, darkly hilarious effect here. It is up to the head of the critics circle, Peregrine Devlin, played by Ian Hendry, along with the incredibly incompetent police force, to put an end to the murders before Lionheart comes for them all, an ambition that, fortunately for the viewer, seems to elude them for most of the runtime. The idea for the film was initiated by former Hollywood agent Sam Jaffe and producers Stanley Mann, John Cohn and Gustav Byrne, and was initially conceived as a spoof of horror films. But it was when the project was given to screenwriter Anthony Greville Bell that the central conceit, an actor seeking revenge on his critics, came into being. Greville Bell was born in Australia and was a member of the British Army Royal Engineers during World War II, after which he travelled widely and wrote several screenplays, 3 of which were adapted into films. There was a 1970s bank robbery movie called Perfect Friday, which starred Ursula Andress, Stanley Baker and David Warner, 1972's The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie, a US thriller starring Bonnie Bedelia and Jack Starrett, and of course Theatre of Blood. The screenplay began life with the fortunately abandoned title of Much Ado About Murder, which to me sounds more like a Margaret Rutherford Miss Marple movie than it does a horror film, and certainly lent in more to the comedic aspect than the Grand Guignol brutality that we see on screen. The character of Edward Lionheart was named after 2 British kings and was based on several British stage actors, but was initially inspired by the British actor Sir Donald Wolfett. Beginning his stage career in the 1920s and giving his final performance in 1967, Wolfett was known for a fairly bombastic performance style, but many have called him one of the greatest stage actors of his generation. He was particularly celebrated for his performance as King Lear, which was called by influential theatre critic James Agate, quote, "the greatest performance of Shakespearean acting that I have ever seen," end quote. But eventually, his acting style fell out of favour due to changing tastes, and although he brought Shakespeare to the masses, towards the later part of his career, he was eclipsed by the emergence of younger and far more subtle performers, including John Gielgud. This change in trend caused some critics to declare him imprisoned by the past, while others accused him of the mortal sin of pandering to provincial appetites. His 1947 Broadway season of Shakespeare was particularly condemned by the critics, with one asking explicitly, quote, "If the classics are to be done in such a way, would it perhaps be better not to do them at all?" End quote. While another wrote, quote, "You are likely to wish not so much that they would cut the play as cut it out." End quote. These lines could, in fact, all be direct quotes from members of Theatre of Blood's critics' circle, and one can only imagine that if Wolfett had lived long enough, he would have been cheering Edward Lionheart on from the sidelines. Sadly, he passed away in 1968, but not before being knighted for his services to British theatre a decade earlier, in 1957. You can judge for yourself by watching some of his many film appearances, which admittedly are rather dated by today's standards. These include the British 1954 thriller Svengali, 1958's Blood of the Vampire, which is not the best film in the world, in my opinion, 1960's The Hands of Orlac, and also a relatively minor role in the multi-award-winning 1963 epic Lawrence of Arabia. As you may have guessed from the earlier synopsis, Theatre of Blood is very much a black comedy, featuring over-the-top murder scenes that make Dr. Phibes look like an amateur in comparison. There are also some incredibly sarcastic comedic asides, including Ian Hendry commenting that only Lionheart would have the temerity to rewrite Shakespeare, and the review of the actor provided by one of the ill-fated critics, which puts one in mind of the criticisms of Sir Donald Wolfett. Quote, "Mr. Lionheart's rendering of the role can only be described as villainous. Laid between the delicately underplayed performances of Miss Lillywhite as Lavinia and Miss Mole as Tamora, one is irresistibly reminded of a ham sandwich." End quote. There is also a laugh-out-loud moment when Lionheart poses as a groovy 1970s hairdresser called Butch, only to murder Price's soon-to-be off-screen wife, the actress Coral Brown. Quite honestly, the dialogue, wigs and clothing in this sequence have to be seen to be believed, and it's worth renting the movie just for this moment alone. But more than this, the screenplay gives Price the opportunity to recite Shakespeare after each murder, revealing a talent that was described by co-star Diana Rigg in a later interview. Quote, "What people don't know, unless they have seen the film, and tend to forget because of his horror movies, is what a great classical actor he would have been. Listening to him deliver some of those Shakespearean speeches, I remember thinking, God, what a missed opportunity." End quote. No small comment coming from an actress trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and herself a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Interestingly, given the film's status in his career, Price himself was uncertain about taking on the role, which was offered to him by Sam Jaffe, one of the brains behind the project, who had once been his agent. Less than keen to appear in yet another horror film, his opinion changed once he read the script and recognised it as an opportunity to perform Shakespeare on screen and to demonstrate his considerable depths of talent. Along with Witchfinder General, The Mask of the Red Death, and one or two of the other Poe adaptations, Theatre of Blood is probably Vincent Price's best horror performance, allowing him to display a depth of character and pathos not afforded him in many of his other roles. By the end of the film, one cannot help but feel pity for Lionheart, particularly given the sheer vanity and nastiness of the critic circle, most of whom the viewer cannot wait to see get their comeuppance. Because, while Edward Lionheart is the supposed antagonist of the movie, the real villains are of course the critics. For anyone who has ever worked in the creative arts, Theatre of Blood serves as wish fulfillment, something probably best summed up by one of Price's monologues. Quote, How many actors have you destroyed as you destroyed me? How many talented lives have you cut down with your glib attacks? What do you know of the blood, sweat, and toil of a theatrical production, of the dedication of the men and women in the noblest profession of them all? How could you know, you talentless fools, who spew vitriol on the creative efforts of others because you lack the ability to create yourselves? End quote. No wonder Lionheart's daughter Edwina refers to the critics' circle as butchers. Once Price agreed to the film, a production deal was quickly made with United Artists, and the rest of the cast fell into place. As well as the previously mentioned Ian Hendry and Australian-American actress Coral Browne, the rest of the circle is played by a cast of familiar British actors, all of whom signed on within a few weeks of Price agreeing to the movie. These include Arthur Lowe, Dennis Price, Harry Andrews, Robert Morley, Michael Hordern, Robert Coote, and, in one of his final screen appearances, Jack Hawkins. Hawkins, due to an earlier operation for throat cancer, was unable to speak and was dubbed by the actor Charles Gray, who played the villainous MacArthur in Hammer's 1967 horror The Devil Rides Out. The critics' circle are portrayed as elitist, self-absorbed and unfeeling, showing little concerns for their fallen comrades and displaying deep-seated character flaws that serve as their comeuppance. The ironically named Trevor Dickman is lured to his doom by his own lecherous designs on a supposed young actress. Oliver Larding, who clearly enjoys a drink or two, is drowned in a vat of wine at a supposed tasting. Gourmand Meredith Merridew is choked to death on the aforementioned pie, and Miss Chloe Moon, vain and always impeccably dressed, is electrocuted during a hair appointment, one that she chooses to keep despite knowing that there is a mad murderer on her trail. And while we are on the subject of Miss Chloe Moon, it is no wonder that she is so beautifully dressed. Actress Coral Browne insisted that she would only play the part if her costumes were designed by the British designer Jean Muir. This took the film well over budget and also infuriated the costume designer Michael Baldwin, who was further enraged after filming to discover that Browne allegedly kept all the costumes for herself. Price, however, was very much smitten with the actress, and the two would eventually be married in 1974, following a little bit of matchmaking from Diana Rigg, who was not aware that Price was still very much married at the time. In the movie, Rigg plays Lionheart's daughter, Edwina, who, despite outward appearances to the contrary, is his more than willing accomplice, donning a variety of costumes and disguises, including, in a rather surprising twist, that of Lionheart's mustachioed sidekick. Rigg took on the role due to the strength of the screenplay, and later went on to describe the film as both brilliant and original, saying that the characters were wonderful and that there was also an implacability about the movie, in the knowledge that everyone was going to get murdered at some time or another. Although she worked on the movie during the day, in the evenings she was engaged at the National Theatre, performing, ironically enough, with the Royal Shakespeare Company, a duality that she described as, quote, witty and wonderful and funny to be doing the classics on one hand and a spoof of the classics on the other, end quote. She did, though, admit that at times the film is a bit clunky in places, which, being completely objective, it certainly is. But as for the many costume changes and multiple characters, she said she loved them all, though by her own admission, it was, quote-unquote, awfully hard to be a fella. She also very much enjoyed working with such a talented cast, all of whom she described as brilliant, and commented at the time that she had no idea making the film would be so enjoyable, describing working with Vincent Price as heaven. Her character, Edwina, also has some remarkably funny one-liners when in disguise, telling a soon-to-be victim that they have adapted The Merchant of Venice by adding a rather large cut, and describing the hairdresser Butch as chic. Quote, "He does Princess Margaret's hair. Chicks like that. All the ladies go to Butch." End quote. Along with those already mentioned, we also have a veteran comedy actor Eric Sykes, who also turns up, rather unexpectedly, as Mr. Tuttle in the 2001 Nicole Kidman movie The Others. There's also Diana Dawes, who a year later would appear in From Beyond the Grave, which we discussed in episode 29, and Joan Hickson, who would go on to play Miss Marple for the BBC. Here, Hickson provides a grimly funny turn as the wife of third victim Horace Sprout, confusing the sound of his decapitation with snoring in a scene which progresses to some gruesome slapstick involving his severed head. Directing duties were assigned to Douglas Hickox, who had worked primarily as an assistant director and second unit director through the 1950s and early 1960s. This work includes the highly enjoyable 1958 sci-fi Fiend Without a Face, the entertaining, if rather creaky, suspense movie The House in Marsh Road in 1960, the, in my opinion, not very good at all, Snake Woman in 1961, and also in 1961, the Margaret Rutherford Miss Marple movie, Murder, She Said. And I know that Miss Marple's name seems to be cropping up rather a lot in this episode, but I assure you it's all entirely unintentional. Following on from this, Hickox moved on to directing TV shows and commercials, before making his feature film debut in 1970 with the very dark comedy Entertaining Mr. Sloane. This was an adaptation of the play by the British playwright Joe Orton, and was described by the LA Times as outrageous, hilarious, and a pitch-black comedy, something that it has very much in common with Theatre of Blood. Filming took place on location across Greater London, including Putney, Chelsea, Hyde Park, and Windsor. The abandoned theatre, which serves as Lionheart's Lair, was the Putney Hippodrome, which began life as a theatre in 1902, before becoming an Odeon cinema in 1940, and then closing altogether in 1961. Because it was scheduled for demolition shortly after filming completed, the crew of Theatre of Blood were given pretty much free rein to do whatever they wanted, including the lighting of small controlled fires across the building during the film's climax. On its release in 1973, Hickox was praised by the Monthly Film Bulletin for his location shooting and also a constantly moving camera, which, quote, prevents the brazen theatricality of the whole scheme becoming too overt, end quote. The publication, though, also commented that the third section of the film drags a little, which, to be fair, it probably does. But what is completely inexcusable, in my opinion, is their comment that the Titus Andronicus murder of Meredith Merridew is merely unpleasant, when, for me, it is one of the highlights of the film, and I say that as a confirmed dog lover. Other critics were also complimentary, with the LA Times calling it the best horror film Vincent Price had ever made, and describing it as, quote, a triumph of witty, stylish grand guignol, allowing Price to range richly between humour and pathos, end quote. Time magazine complimented the cast and said that it found the film funny, but it also missed the point by suggesting that the gore and violence was so brutal that it ended up spoiling the joke. This stands in direct contrast to Variety, which singled out the decapitation of Horace Sprout as a moment of high comedy, and was also highly complimentary about both Diana Rigg and Vincent Price. Following Theatre of Blood, Price did indeed divorce his second wife Mary and married Coral Brown in 1974, with the two remaining together until her death in 1991. At this point, his film career started to slow down a little, reflecting changing tastes in horror and also his increasing age. He was already 62 when he made Theatre of Blood, and roles started to become a little more thin on the ground. That being said, subsequent horror movies include 1974's Madhouse, in which he co-starred with Peter Cushing, Robert Quarry and Linda Hayden, the rather weak anthology movie The Monster Club in 1981, in which he played a friendly vampire, and Pete Walker's The House of Long Shadows in 1983, which cast him alongside Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, John Carradine and Sheila Keith. Despite the pedigree of that cast, I think it's fair to say that House of Long Shadows is rather disappointing, at least in my opinion, and overall it feels a little bit like a wasted opportunity. However, although film work became thin on the ground, this is not to suggest that he stopped working. Instead, he pivoted more towards TV roles, voice work and theatre. In 1973, he began recording a BBC radio series called The Price of Fear, acting as both host and occasional performer in adaptations of stories by Roald Dahl and R. Chetwynd Hayes, among others. Episodes are available on both YouTube and Audible, and if you're a fan of radio drama, they are definitely worth seeking out. In 1977, he also began a 3-year run of a theatrical one-man show called Diversions and Delights, in which he played the playwright Oscar Wilde, something that he later referred to as his greatest achievement as an actor, starring in over 800 performances across more than 300 cities in both the US and Australia. Having worked in TV since 1949, he had already appeared in shows including Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Science Fiction Theatre, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Get Smart, and The Mod Squad, and he continued TV work for the rest of his career, including Night Gallery, The Brady Bunch, The Bionic Woman, and memorably The Muppet Show, where he appeared opposite a vampire, Kermit the Frog. In 1982, he lent his velvety voice to Michael Jackson's Thriller album, performing the spoken word section, one hesitates to call it a rap, at the end of the title track. This would be released as a single in 1984, accompanied by what was, at the time, the most expensive music video ever made, a homage to classic horror directed by John Landis. Recording his contribution to the album for a flat fee of $20,000, he received no further residuals, something he commented on the British TV series Aspel and Company. Quote, "Michael sent me a wonderful gift. It's a framed picture of him, life-sized, dressed, and it has a platinum record on it and a gold record. And at the bottom it says, 'To Vincent Price, thank you so much for your help with Thriller and in celebration of the 30 millionth album.' Can you believe that? And I got none of it. I'm not bitter, mind you. I'm not bitter. Just hurt." End quote. This was delivered in his usual dry and sardonic tone, but, as the saying goes, many a true word is spoken in jest. Now, of course, this was the contract that he signed, so there was no legal wrongdoing on Jackson's part. But with 30 million albums sold, one can only imagine what even a small percentage of the sales and the round-the-clock MTV and radio plays might have added up to. In the same year that he recorded Thriller, he also narrated Tim Burton's stop-motion short Vincent, and in 1986, he provided the voice of Professor Rattigan in Walt Disney Pictures' Basil the Great Mouse Detective. A year later, he appeared with Bette Davis and Lillian Gish in the movie The Whales of August, and then made his final live-action screen appearance, working with Tim Burton once again on Edward Scissorhands, which was released in 1990. Technically, though, his final film role was in 1993's The Thief and the Cobbler, an animated feature for which he again provided voice work. On the 25th of October 1993, Vincent Price died from lung cancer at the age of 82. Including films and television, he left behind a legacy of over 200 screen acting credits, only a portion of which were horror. For me, Theatre of Blood stands out as one of his greatest performances, and it's a film that I return to often. As for Price himself, he said of the movie, quote, "It was the best feeling of achievement and satisfaction I ever had from a film. It was my favourite funny film. There were infinite possibilities, a splendid cast. I fell in love with one of them, Coral Brown, married her, and lived happily ever after." End quote. All of which brings us on to our second movie of the week, which is Stagefright from 1987, directed by Michele Soavi and starring David Brandon, Barbara Cupisti, Mary Sellers, and Giovanni Lombardo Radice. Like many Italian horrors of the era, this movie is known by multiple titles depending on the region in which it was released. These include Deliria, Aquarius, and Bloody Bird. And be prepared in this segment to hear a multitude of Italian names and aliases, as many of the people we are discussing are more commonly known by their anglicised screen names. Again, a very common occurrence in Italian genre cinema of the period. Fortunately, Michele Soavi tends to be known by his actual name, at least as a director anyway, and this helps to avoid muddying the waters even further. An actor, as well as a writer and director, for a brief period at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 1990s, he was seen as the future of Italian horror cinema, and a worthy successor to the likes of Mario Bava, Dario Argento, and Lucio Fulci. Sadly, the 1990s decline of the Italian film industry in general, and horror cinema specifically, meant that this would not be the case. But before this, he directed a handful of films that should be of interest to any fan of genre cinema. These are The Church from 1989, The Sect from 1991, Della Morte dell'Amore, or Cemetery Man, in 1994, and his feature film debut, Stagefright, which was released in 1987. Born in Milan in 1957, his father was a poet, author, and journalist, and his mother was the daughter of Adriano Olivetti, the Italian manufacturer of computers, tablets, smartphones, and, for those of us old enough to remember, the typewriter. He was bitten by the horror bug at the age of 12, when he snuck into the local movie theatre to watch Dario Argento's debut feature, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. He recalled this experience many years later in a 2023 interview with Fangoria magazine, and I'm going to share an extract with you here, as it describes not just the impact of the film itself, but also the experience of going to the movies during the 1970s. Quote, "When I was a kid, cinema was a big event. Nowadays, everything is on TV, and we can see everything and study everything over and over again. But even tape machines or VCRs didn't exist back then. So when you saw a film, you were just building the imagery in your brain so that you could remember it later. But sometimes, when you try to remember it, what you're remembering wasn't actually in the film. You have a memory of something that might not exist. What I remember most was the silent auditorium and how Dario was hypnotizing people with his camera. I remember thinking, how does he do this? It was just so impressive." End quote. Soavi did not, however, enter the film industry as a director. With an initial ambition to become an actor, he enrolled in acting classes and gained his first film experience as an extra in 1975 in the film The School Teacher, which starred the queen of 1970s Italian cinema, Edwige Fenech. Other minor roles followed, but acting, as we know, is very sporadic, and as his family wanted to ensure that he could survive financially on his own, occasional acting roles really weren't enough. He used his proximity to the industry to undertake small production jobs to earn more money and also gain experience, saying, quote, Suddenly, I was working for 5 weeks, not just 3 days, which helped me survive on my own instead of relying on my parents. And when I did this, it was never frustrating, because I was always working." End quote. This work included acting in the Italian rip-off Alien 2 on Earth, sometimes known as Alien Terror, and crucially, a small role in Lucio Fulci's City of the Living Dead, the first part of the director's Gates of Hell trilogy, which was filmed in the US and released in 1980. One day on set, he asked the production manager what else he could do, and was made an assistant grip, working alongside the camera crew to adjust equipment between shots, ensuring equipment was set up and maintained, and also setting up safety equipment and ensuring that rigging was always secure. All of a sudden, he said, he was right next to the camera and right next to Lucio Fulci, giving him the ability to not only participate but also to learn on set, something that he was incredibly proud of because he felt like he wasn't wasting time. As well as Lucio Fulci, he also made connections with Lamberto Bava, the son of Mario Bava, who was becoming a director in his own right with his 1980 debut feature Macabre, a film for which Soavi had auditioned but had been unsuccessful. Nevertheless, despite being turned down, an important connection was made and the two became great friends, with Soavi sharing stories that he had written and the two discussing how they could be translated into film. At the same time that Fulci was making City of the Living Dead and Lamberto Bava was making Macabre, Dario Argento was making Inferno, his follow-up to 1977's Suspiria, and the film that many people consider to be his masterpiece. This was also released in 1980, which, as it turns out, was a bit of a bumper year for Italian genre cinema. Soavi had originally auditioned for one of the roles, but at 22 was far too young, though this did not stop him making a connection, as he recalled in the book Spaghetti Nightmares. Quote, "In 1980, immediately after Argento finished filming Inferno, I telephoned the production company 4 or 5 times to try to talk to Dario. After eventually managing to speak with him, I arranged to go and see him, and took a couple of treatments I'd written with me. I explained who I was, that I was 22, and that I liked his films very much. And basically, after we'd been chatting for about an hour, we discovered that we agreed not only about cinema, but also about books that we read, and esotericism, and a lot of things that we both basically liked. He then read the 2 stories, and a month later we met up again. We chatted again for 20 minutes, and he told me he liked one of the stories more than the other, and promised that he would get in touch for his next film." End quote. This next film was 1982's Tenebrae, a film on which his friend Lamberto Bava had already been employed as assistant director. Bava suggested that Soavi would make a good second assistant, but at the time Michele was already working on another film project. Rather surprisingly, he initially declined Argento's offer until his then-girlfriend pointed out to him that this was in fact an opportunity of a lifetime, which, as it turns out, it was. After Tenebrae, he worked as an assistant director on Lamberto Bava's Giallo, A Blade in the Dark, which was released in 1983, Dario Argento's Phenomena, which was released in 1985, and Lamberto Bava's completely bonkers Demons, which was also released in 1985. And as well as an assistant director on this last movie, he also appears as the metal masked man in the subway at the beginning, and as one of the characters in the Film Within a Film that plays in the soon-to-be demonically overrun picture house. But it was possibly his work on Phenomena that gave him his greatest exposure to the art of directing, as he was given responsibility for directing the set, while Argento focused on planning every shot with his customary attention to detail. This situation was one that Soavi recalled in a Fangoria interview, saying, quote, "Jennifer Connelly was the star, and she was only 13 years old. My first real challenge was to hold the set and direct the set, because Dario didn't like to direct the set. He would spend hours in the hotel, thinking and envisioning every shot in his head. So he relied on me to do the set work every day. He dictated every shot and every scene in his room to me. I'd even record our conversations, so that I didn't lose anything that he wanted to do. It's unbelievable how he worked. And you saw the movie too, because he'd tell you in such detail. Okay, so we go from a wide shot, into a tracking shot, into a side shot, and so on and so forth. Once we were in Switzerland, which was the film's shooting location, this let me take the reins and direct the set, because he dictated every frame to me so I could explain it to everyone. End quote. From here, Soavi began directing himself, with a music video for the track Valley by Bill Wyman, which was used in the Phenomena soundtrack, and then with a documentary called Dario Argento's World of Horror. Along the way, he had also been working with the film director Aristide Massachesi, who is known most commonly under the screen name of Joe D'Amato. A very different director to the likes of Bava and Argento, Massachesi had been working in film since the 1950s, but was very much at the lower end of the budgetary scale, with crews as small as 8 people and shooting schedules of less than 3 weeks. We'll be speaking about a couple of his films in a few moments, but it's fair to say that they really aren't of the greatest quality. Nevertheless, as Soavi himself has said, quote, "I learned a lot by eating the good food of Dario Argento and the poor food of Joe D'Amato." End quote. And this was more than just a learning experience. Massachesi was a producer as well as a director and had clearly seen Soavi's potential. It was he who suggested that he make his first feature, and it was he who found him the screenplay for Stagefright. And now we are getting into the spoilers, though to be honest, as Stagefright is a body count movie, there really isn't a huge amount to spoil. There are plenty of shocks, but very few surprises. But if you don't want to know the order, or indeed the manner in which some of the cast are dispatched, it's time to hit the pause button. And fair warning, I'm also going to be discussing some fairly grisly sequences in relation to this film and also a handful of others. So this next section probably isn't one to listen to if you're tucking into your dinner. The specific subgenre of this film is one that has been up for debate, or at least it is on social media. Many call it a slasher film, which, despite my comments last week about not being the biggest slasher fan, I would say it probably is. Others prefer to term it as a giallo, which in my opinion, it really isn't. At the risk of being accused of the modern-day trespass of gatekeeping, Stagefright seems to fall afoul of the notion that any Italian film shot with a vibrant palette and lavish cinematography must be a giallo, and this is in much the same way that any film set outside of a metropolis now seems to immediately be categorised as folk horror. As we have discussed in several episodes before now, strictly speaking, the giallo is mystery cinema, and in Stagefright, there really is no mystery at all. We know who the killer is, why he is killing, and who the survivor is going to be, as this is a movie in which the final girl is signposted right from the outset. None of this, by the way, is meant as a criticism of the movie. In fact, I would say that the simplicity and efficiency of the narrative is one of the film's strong points, as it allows Soavi the opportunity to concentrate on the visuals, sound design, and incredibly over-the-top murders. The plot of Stagefright can be described as follows. A theatre company are rehearsing what appears to be the most 1980s musical ever, complete with a saxophone playing Marilyn Monroe. They have all been locked in the theatre for the night by their tyrannical director, a man who makes James Cameron appear laid back and relaxed by comparison, though this is doubtless due to the bumps of cocaine that he sniffs throughout the movie. Unfortunately, and unbeknownst to them, They are also locked in with an escaped madman, an insane former actor who has already killed 17 victims and who has ambitions to increase his high score. Across the course of the narrative, the actors, crew, producer and director are picked off one by one with a pickaxe, electric drill, butcher knife, strangulation, and everyone's favourite weapon of choice, a chainsaw, though quite why a chainsaw is backstage in a provincial theatre is never completely explained. As you can tell, this is not a movie for those of you who like to pull at holes in film logic. Then again, perhaps it's exactly the type of movie for people who like to do that. But that isn't really the purpose of the film. Much like Ridley Scott's Alien, of which it is structurally reminiscent, the purpose of Stagefright is to trap its characters in a confined space and then let the carnage begin. The screenplay was written by Luigi Montefiore, a writer, actor, artist and director who to many is best known by his anglicised screen name George Eastman and who has been a fixture of European genre cinema since his screen debut in 1966. This was an uncredited role in Django Shoots First, one of a series of Italian westerns that borrowed the name of the central character from the 1966 Franco Nero movie of the same name. From here, Montefiore appeared in several so-called spaghetti westerns, while also working in other genres, including Federico Fellini's Satyricon in 1969 and the Charlton Heston family adventure The Call of the Wild in 1972. Montefiore's screen presence and towering 6'9" frame made him perfect for villainous roles, and this is something that he performed with manic gusto in 1974's Rabid Dogs, directed by Mario Bava. This is the story of three armed robbers who steal a car and, along with some hostages, go on a violent road trip that takes place, for the most part, in real time. Unfortunately, the film suffered from a very troubled production, with the bankruptcy of the producer midway through photography leading to it being shelved for over 2 decades. At this point, it was released in multiple versions, with original footage removed and some scenes partially reshot. Nevertheless, in some circles, it has been hailed as an overlooked masterpiece, though it does have some very uncomfortable moments and also an incredibly downbeat twist ending. At the same time as acting, Montefiore also began writing for movies, an occupation that he started in the mid-1970s, a period in which he was treated as an outcast and unable to find acting work following a physical confrontation with a director who he subsequently described as being a slave driver. Both penniless and homeless, he turned to writing as an act of desperation, though fortunately it turned into a rather successful career. In 1976, he wrote the story and co-authored the screenplay for Keoma, one of the final Italian westerns of the 1970s, and one that is frequently cited as being the best ever made, and he would continue writing for film and TV, even up to the date of recording. Working mainly in low-budget exploitation cinema, I think it's fair to say that, with a few exceptions, Montefiore was looking to make a living as opposed to making high art. He has been refreshingly honest in his opinions about many of the films he has both starred in and written, admitting that they were done mainly to pay the bills, and that he thinks that some of the results were, in his own words, quote-unquote, decidedly crummy. And, as if to prove his point, in 1980 he both co-wrote and starred in the movie for which he is possibly best known, though perhaps notorious is a better expression. This was Anthropophagus, also released as The Grim Reaper, a film that he co-wrote with director Aristide Massachesi, who we mentioned briefly earlier. Described as having a noted place in the annals of the escalation of gore, this film is, in my opinion, incredibly boring before becoming deeply unpleasant, leading to a gore-filled second half that led it to, unsurprisingly, being banned as a video nasty in the UK. In this, he plays a cannibalistic killer who, at the climax, eats his own intestines, and this is probably just the least of the atrocities, which are all a bit too nasty to go into here. Ironically, given this premise, on a personal level, Montefiore himself is not a fan of gore movies, even though he admits that making them can be fun at the time. In an interview for the book Spaghetti Nightmares, he revealed, quote, "As far as gore is concerned, I must say, to be honest, I don't really like it, even though I enjoy writing and acting in this genre of film. I never go and see a horror film unless I know it's a very good one. I don't like the violent scenes, the baby lambs made to look like embryos, the pig's entrails, and so on, and I believe it's curious and rather worrying that there are people who enjoy this kind of thing. If it were up to me, I would write horror stories which were effective and brutal if necessary, but without a drop of blood." End quote. Regardless, after this, he would write and star in 1981's Absurd, a kind of sequel to Anthropophagus, in which he plays another seemingly unstoppable killer, and which also features more than its fair share of disemboweling. He followed this with the screenplay for 1982's Caligula, The Untold Story, a supposedly historical film designed to cash in on the notoriety of the 1979 Caligula directed by Tinto Brass, and which had starred Helen Mirren, Malcolm McDowell and John Gielgud, among others. As I've mentioned before, this was a time when Italian cinema operated on the Fellone principle, creating direct cash-ins to popular and commercially successful films, though, to be honest, quite often a film didn't have to be that successful to end up being ripped off. Featuring, as I'm sure you may have guessed by now, some extremely gory moments, Caligula, The Untold Story was not very well received on its release, though more recent retrospective reviews have been a bit more favourable. I haven't seen it, so I can't really comment much further. He followed this with the 1983 movie 2020 Texas Gladiators, a post-apocalyptic story which featured a band of warriors in Texas trying to fight against a fascist regime. Not only did he write this, but he also directed it, at the request of his by now frequent collaborator, Aristide Massachesi. In true pragmatic style, he says that he wasn't particularly concerned with how it turned out, and was mainly satisfied with the fact that he had managed to keep to schedule and produce a 95-minute film. This movie was part of a wider trend in Italian cinema of the time to piggyback off the success of the Mad Max films, and Montefiore contributed screenplays for more than a few of these, though again he is brilliantly and brutally honest in his assessment. Quote, "I only wrote these awful movies for financial reasons. The storylines were uninspiring, the narrative structures were predictable, and no attempt at originality was made at all." End quote. And you know, I have to say, the more I've encountered his complete lack of pretension and brutal honesty, the more I kind of love him. However, he would take a very different approach with his next project, writing the story and screenplay that would become Stagefright. This was something that he was asked to do by Massachesi, who intended it to be the debut feature for Michele Soavi. Given that Montefiore and Soavi knew each other very well through working together for years, he was able to write the screenplay specifically with the director in mind. Soavi has said that Massachesi called him one day and advised that he had a script for him to direct, one that had been written to shoot economically, all in one location, and that he was also completely free to cast the actors and change the story as much as he wanted. Montefiore tells a similar tale, saying that he had deliberately written the script to be highly economical and that he had consciously written for a close set so that Soavi could concentrate and keep absolutely everything under his control. It was Montefiore's idea to set the film in a theatre, and his idea that the actors would be rehearsing a musical, saying, quote, "I love dancing," though they didn't actually make a lot of this aspect in the film. I'd originally suggested a longer, and more striking dance scene." End quote. According to the writer, most of the details that we see on screen, including the effects and every death, were described in detail in the script, saying that, quote, "Michele, thank goodness, followed the screenplay to the letter. He directed the film well and with great care, and I wish him the best of luck. He's a very deserving person, as he puts passion and enthusiasm into all of his work." End quote. One change that Soavi did make to the script, though, was the mask worn by the killer, the intriguingly named Irving Wallace. This name, to me, harks back to the writer Edgar Wallace, on whose work many German krimi films, which inspired the giallo genre, were based. I've no idea, though, whether this was intentional or just a happy accident. But in any case, in the screenplay, Wallace wore a clown mask, and Soavi thought this was a little too obvious. Ultimately, he wanted to go for something far more distinctive. The eventual choice of the giant owl head, which has now entered horror iconography, was inspired by Soavi's artist mother, who showed him a magazine with an owl on the cover, something that the director described as sweet, but also, for some reason, rather frightening. During pre-production, he also came across a painting by René Magritte titled The Present, which features an eagle in a man's suit, and a few weeks later, he found a book at a friend's house that had an owl on the cover. "When you get 3 coincidences lining up like that," he said, "you basically have to do it." Not that his producer was particularly on board with the idea. In fact, as Soavi described it, Masachesi told him that the idea was shit. But it would appear that fate would intervene once again. During a conversation in which Soavi was showing his producer a design of the owl mask, a very small spider fell onto the page. Masachesi was, by all accounts, incredibly superstitious and believed that spiders signified good luck. This superstition led him to backing down and agreeing that the owl mask could stay, even though it was actually going to take up pretty much half of the film's budget. And it was a very wise decision. The mask is one of the things that makes the movie stand out from the pack, though, as writer Maitland McDonagh once said, quote, "You can hardly look at the chainsaw-wielding killer in his oversized owl head mask without smiling that this is what 2 decades of taboo busting in horror movies has come to." End quote. The influence of Dario Argento and Mario Bava is very clear in Soavi's direction, which is probably why, as I mentioned earlier, the film is often categorized as a giallo. With its bold color scheme and prowling camera, courtesy of director of photography Renato Tafori, the film is a feast for the eyes. From a shot of a venomous lionfish in an aquarium to the deep blues of the theatre interiors, and of course the spectacular death scenes. All of this is accompanied by an insistent soundtrack composed by the English musician, composer and conductor Simon Boswell. Boswell's film scores have included Dust Devil, Shallow Grave, Santa Sangre, Perdita Durango, Phenomena, Lord of Illusions, and the ABCs of Death, to name just a few. An important figure in cinema since 1985, and hailed as one of the UK's finest living soundtrack composers, Boswell has also worked with musicians including the late and much missed Marianne Faithfull, Blur, Orbital, and Elton John. Fans of the Chemical Brothers will also be familiar with his work, as it was sampled and looped to become their track Block Rockin' Beats. A multi-award winner, including 2 BAFTAs and 1 Classical Brit Award, he is the subject of an excellent movie called The Dark Fantastic, directed by L.G. White. And if you are interested in music production, film composition, genre cinema, or indeed cinema in general, the documentary The Dark Fantastic comes highly recommended. So, do try to track it down, if you can. But, of course, for any horror film, what makes this film stand out are the murder set pieces, which are handled with a real panache, making it quite easy to see why Soavi was frequently hailed as a successor to Dario Argento. The first murder in the film, that of poor Betty who gets a pickaxe in the mouth, is expertly handled, with tension mounting through the highly effective use of rain pelting on the windows of her car. This is something that recalls similar car interiors in Suspiria and Inferno, and which Argento would repeat himself with his 2001 movie Sleepless, a film that we can probably consider to be the cinematic equivalent of a greatest hits album. From here we get the quite brilliant moment where the coke-fueled director Peter screams out for the killer to stab ingenue Corinne, mistaking him for his leading man, and not realising that, first of all, he is in fact Irving Wallace, and that secondly, the knife in his hand is not a prop, but is in fact very real. This is a fantastic sequence that blurs the line between art and reality, something that the film has already done in reverse with its fake-out opening. During the beginning, we are fooled into believing we are watching a murder, before the camera pulls back to reveal that it is all a rehearsal, which is certainly disorientating on first viewing. Given that Corinne is the person who has hidden the key to the theatre, at director Peter's request, this murder leaves them all trapped inside, and I think it's fair to say that Peter, who is played brilliantly by the Irish actor David Brandon, is at best a self-absorbed egotist, or perhaps more accurately, as Soavi likes to call him, an absolute piece of shit. Pretty much everything that happens in the movie is all his fault, and it is therefore incredibly satisfying when he finally gets his comeuppance, reduced to trying to bargain with a madman, which is always a smart move, before meeting the wrong end of a chainsaw, and also, just for good measure, the sharp blade of an axe. I'm not going to detail every one of the murders here, mainly because there is one, at least, that is jaw-droppingly surprising, and I'd hate to ruin it for anybody. But suffice it to say that all but our final girl, Alicia, are bumped off in fairly rapid succession, leaving her locked in with the killer and desperately trying to find a way out. This leads to one of the film's most iconic images, the owl-headed killer sitting on a stage surrounded by posed corpses, with feathers gently floating about him. This scenario is reminiscent of the climax of a couple of other slasher movies, including 1981's Happy Birthday to Me, but here both the imagery, lighting and music crank it up more than a few notches, with the posing of the corpses also delivering a few wry smiles from the audience. Well, they did from me, anyway. The cast is a veritable who's who of genre cinema. I've already mentioned David Brandon, who, after his debut as Ariel in Derek Jarman's 1978 punk art house film Jubilee, appeared in Caligula, The Untold Story, Delirium, Photos of Joya, Beyond Darkness, and Scarlet Diva, to name just a few. Barbara Cupisti, who plays Alicia, starred in Fulci's The New York Ripper, Argento's Opera, and Soavi's two subsequent movies, The Church and Della Morte dell'Amore, and also went on to become a director of multiple human rights documentaries. You should also look out for Soavi himself, playing one of the cops called after the murder of Betty, and who is stationed, pretty pointlessly, outside the theatre all night while the murders continue inside. But perhaps the most recognisable genre regular is Giovanni Lombardo Radice, a man once called the most put-upon actor in all of Italian cinema. His films have included Fulci's City of the Living Dead, Ruggero Deodato's The House at the Edge of the Park and The Phantom of Death, Antonio Margheriti's Cannibal Apocalypse, Umberto Lenzi's Cannibal Ferox, Lamberto Bava's Body Puzzle, as well as The Church and The Sect for Michele Soavi. I won't say that he dies a horrible death in all of these movies, but to be honest, he generally does. Outside of Italy, he also appeared in Martin Scorsese's 2002 movie Gangs of New York, and also the 2006 remake of The Omen. In total, His career spanned over 60 movies as an actor before his untimely death in 2023. Although Massachusetts productions were usually scheduled for 3 to 4 weeks, Stagefright ran far over, something driven by Soavi's experience of working with Argento and the lessons he learned about absolute precision in filmmaking. As a result, it was also massively over budget, something that was pretty much a disaster for the studio, and the film was temporarily stopped midway through filming as they had pretty much run out of money. The crew was massively scaled back, and Massachusetts joined the production as the DP, enabling the film to be finished at a much smaller scale and greatly reduced costs. Overall, Stagefright is a highly enjoyable entry in 1980s Italian horror, and one that I feel is more successful personally than Lamberto Bava's Demons, a film with which it shares more than a few similarities, and which is one that I also greatly enjoy. Neither movie is one that you could say has a great deal of subtext, but then that really isn't the point. They are carnival rides of films, and this one certainly dazzles with its soundtrack, its visuals, and of course its brutal and inventive murder scenes. There is, though, also a strange resonance to the very final moments, which, again, I'm not going to spoil for you here, but the final lines of dialogue, for me at least, linger long after the movie has ended. On its release in 1987, the film went under many names, including, as I mentioned earlier, Bloody Bird, Deliria, Aquarius, and Soundstage Massacre. The choice of Aquarius, which was the director's favourite, was a deliberate attempt to reference the idea of an aquarium, and the fact that as viewers, we are very much spectators looking in through a fishbowl, something which is of course echoed in the earlier mentioned shot of the lionfish. As you can imagine, given the levels of violence, the film did not exactly please the film censors in multiple countries, particularly in Australia, where several shots were snipped to avoid it being banned altogether. In Italy, it was softened by the producers, who wanted a release that would be suitable for a younger audience, something that left Soavi dissatisfied with the final Italian cut, and he later expressed a preference for the English language version for this reason. Overall, the film was well received by critics, and it also did incredibly well at the French Avoriaz Fantastic Film Festival, winning the Fear Section prize in the year of its release. Incidentally, the film that won the main prize at the festival that year was David Lynch's Blue Velvet, which puts both Stagefright and Soavi in very good company. Following the release of Stagefright, Soavi would continue to direct, while also making cameo appearances and working as an assistant director. In 1987, he worked as assistant director on Argento's opera, and also appeared briefly as a police officer. A year later, in 1988, he served as the second unit director for Terry Gilliam on his film The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, based on the strength of Stagefright, which Gilliam enjoyed very much. He followed this with The Church in 1989 and The Sect in 1991, both of which were produced by Dario Argento. In 1994, he released what is possibly his best film, Della Morte dell'Amore, or Cemetery Man, and this is one that we will be covering later in the series, as it is absolutely bonkers and has to be seen to be believed. After the release of Della Morte dell'Amore, he retreated from filmmaking to spend time with his family. He returned to the industry in 1999, by which point it was very much changed. Italian cinema had undergone a financial crisis, and the rise of television and home video and a general lack of financing meant that the age of the Italian horror film was over. Most directors, with the exception of Dario Argento, were now working in television, and Soavi was no exception, though this is not to say he sees this as a bad thing. In his 2023 Fangoria interview, he said, quote, "It's basically the same as when I directed features. It's not thrillers or horror, but it's still very high quality. If I'm being honest, I didn't lose anything to TV, because TV is big now and the language is still the same. I'm still enjoying and amusing myself with the work, because Italian cinema these days is very dry. There's no horror films in Italy anymore, because it's not commercial in this country. But here's the thing about the past. It might still come back one day. End quote. And let's hope that at some point, both it and he are able to. Theatre of Blood and Stagefright are of course both films set in the theatre, and both concern actors of questionable sanity committing a series of violent murders through excessive means. Both are essentially body count movies, with a cast of rather odious characters serving as fodder for the killer, leaving the audience to wonder, to misquote the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who will survive and what will be left of them. But while Irving Wallace is a masked cipher with no real motivation other than a relentless need to kill, Edward Lionheart is a character of great depth and pathos, a tragic figure who the audience cannot help but pity despite the terrible acts that he commits. And though one killer is inhuman while the other all too human, both provide us with gruesome spectacle that may not have a significant amount of social commentary, pithy depictions of the theatre world aside, but which are nevertheless highly entertaining. And sometimes you don't really need anything more than that. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also remember, you can email the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week's episode will be released on the 1st of February, so it's only appropriate that we discuss a pair of films that are associated with that very month. First up, we have City of the Dead from 1960, which was released in the US as Horror Hotel. This was directed by John Moxey and stars Christopher Lee, Patricia Jessel, Tom Naylor, Valentine Dial and Venetia Stevenson. We follow this with The Blackcoat's Daughter from 2015 and director Osgood Perkins. This film, which was originally titled February, stars Emma Roberts, Kiernan Shipka, Lucy Boynton and James Remar. If you want to watch along, City of the Dead is widely available for free on YouTube, including, God forgive us, a colorized version, so please make sure you don't watch that one. I have to say though, if it's at all possible, do try to watch a better quality high definition version than the ones that are free on YouTube. And you can do this by renting from Amazon Prime Video, Google Play Movies and Apple TV. But of course, if you want to save some money, you can always watch one of the free ones. And The Blackcoat's Daughter is also available for rental from the very same places. So once again, that's Google Play Movies, Apple TV and Amazon Prime. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.